Today on Keep Classical Weird, some classical pieces are long, I get that. Some pieces are longer. And some pieces feel like you won't even survive them. Welcome, friends, to episode 72 of Keep Classical Weird. I am your host, Casey Bozell, and today we're talking about really long pieces. As part of my research in producing and creating this podcast, I'm often confronted with the question, whether I ask for it or not, why aren't people attending classical music concerts? I know, I opened a can of worms with this question. There are statistics and metrics that can point to a fundamental lack of education in music. The audience in general is not really given the proper context and background to understand why they should be attending a given concert. You can't, for example, throw Shostakovich 10 on a concert with no story about a fascist dictatorship and expect the average Joe concert goer to be completely on board. So that's one reason, and a big reason for educational outlets like this here podcast. Another reason, however, and one that I hear over and over again, the music is just too darn long. Now, honestly, I can sometimes sympathize with this. I'm a performer myself, and I have absolutely caught myself in the middle of concerts wondering how much longer I have left. And part of that is being a victim of the workplace. Of course, all of us are going to check the clock now and then, but sitting through long things is something you really need to prepare your body for. I myself need to stand up and walk around between innings of a baseball game, and forget a Lord of the Rings marathon for me, let alone one of those movies. As a fully fledged classical musician who is head over heels in love with the music she works with and studies, I will fully admit I am absolutely a fan of shorter concerts. Pack some wonderfully powerful pieces into a package of 90 minutes or less, and I leave feeling emotionally fulfilled while still having some of my evening left. But I can hear some of you from the other side of the microphone here immediately upset that this disqualifies some of the most wonderful and important works from the classical repertoire. The Magic Flute, for example, is easily a 3-hour show with intermissions, and it's one of my favorites. Mahler symphonies are sometimes the only piece programmed on a concert that will take nearly 2 hours. Long, immersive pieces of performance art have their rightful place in concerts, and they absolutely should. Now here's the other side of that coin. How long is too long? Think about the longest movie you sat through. Maybe it kept you captivated the entire time. Maybe you thought it was about 45 minutes too long, but it's an experience that you will no doubt remember, and it most likely sticks with you. The effect of time passing within a performance of some kind is definitely a component of the art itself, if for no other reason than it affects you emotionally. Let's talk about what the artistic effect is of these pieces of music. Mahler's Third Symphony, when it's programmed onto orchestral concerts, is often the only thing on the program. It stands alone as an epic work for orchestra, chorus, and an alto soloist. If you're signing up to hear this program, you're in for a wonderfully epic and emotional ride that will clock in at just under 2 hours. Sometimes longer. Sometimes orchestras take an intermission. What's that you say, Casey? That's just silly. It's a long symphonic work, sure, but it's not like I've had an entire evening at a ballet or an opera. Excellent point, stranger, and thank you for downloading this podcast. Let's get into opera. Opera is an immersive performance art combining just about every facet of art together in one package deal. You've got music, theater, sometimes dance, creative stories, and often stunning visual art that's represented through costumes and scenery. The top 10 most performed operas in the world have runtimes that range from 2 to almost 4 hours, especially when you add in intermissions. This is a specific experience you're signing yourself up for, not a simple, let's go hear a piece of music. It's long-form, live theater with some of the best and most courageous things to ever come out of human bodies. Some operas tend to even reach even more epic of a status, as they sometimes come as more of a set of operas rather than singular works, but we'll touch on that later in the episode. Now, what about works that don't have a clear delineation of acts or movements and are therefore unable to take an intermission? Now we're talking. I've got Morton Feldman on the list for a future podcast episode because he was a 20th century avant-garde composer who wasn't John Cage, though the two had a very tight friendship. He published a few essays outlining his thoughts and approaches to music. And my personal favorite scholarly quote of his, "Polyphony sucks." His specialty was music that was very quiet and very slow, and in 1983, he published his String Quartet No. 2, which takes, more or less, 5 to 6 hours to perform. That's with absolutely no break from the performers. It's unclear how reading this music was accomplished in the 80s, especially without getting lost, but musicians who were lucky enough to perform this piece in recent history often have had to coordinate it by all reading the same score off of different tablets, with one of the musicians being responsible for turning the pages. The two violinists and violists in the group will most likely lose feelings in their limbs partway through, and all the players might have to go through some extra strength and conditioning just to play this one particular piece. Playing slowly and carefully actually often requires more effort than normal, which makes this a real demanding feat. Okay, back to opera for a moment. If you stuck around with this podcast for long enough, you may remember the craziest opera tournament we had several years ago. If this doesn't ring a bell, well, that's fine. Things have been wild for all of us. In episode 16, one of the entrants into the craziest opera tournament was The Ring Cycle by Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner went deep into creating this incredibly large work. He wrote the story, he composed the music, he even designed the opera house that he thought could ideally contain this work and actually managed to get it built. Each opera in the cycle can be its own standalone work, so you don't have to see them in order. But Wagner did compose the epic in a specific sequence. It's a story that Wagner derived from some Norse and Scandinavian mythology, centering around a ring that grants the owner the power to rule the world. And if Tolkien was here right now, he would adamantly state that that is where the similarity ends between the operas and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so you can just stop right there. No, you don't have to stop right there if you don't want to. There are a million think pieces on the internet comparing the two. There are 4 operas in all, and back to back, their performances would equal about 15 hours in total. In comparison, watching the Lord of the Rings theatrical release movies back to back would be 9 hours, 18 minutes, or 17 hours and 12 minutes if you add the Hobbit movies. If we're discussing a collection of works like the Ring Cycle, then certainly we can also count one piece that is just played multiple times. Let's talk about Vexations, which is by composer Erik Satie. Actually, let's take one more step back and just talk about Erik Satie himself, because frankly, the guy deserves his own podcast too. It's not uncommon to ascribe the word eccentric to composers, but Satie is especially so. He landed in Paris at the right time, with some significant points of view on the direction of French music, and his works later influenced some of the biggest names in French Impressionist composers like Ravel and Debussy. He was born Eric, E-R-I-C, but signed his name to things with a K. And towards the second half of his working life, he was even in demand as a writer for several French publications. Not a music critic either, just a creative writer. One of his friends and collaborators described him like this: Satie's case is extraordinary. He's a mischievous and cunning old artist. At least that's how he thinks of himself. Myself, I think the opposite. He's a very susceptible man, arrogant, a real sad child, but one who is sometimes made optimistic by alcohol. But he's a good friend and I like him a lot. I love that little ending the best. So, among several arcane and really well-known works, his Gymnopédie No. 1 is probably his most well-known thing. He composed a piece entitled Vexations. Now, the inspiration for this piece is under debate. Actually, the instructions for this piece are under debate. His writing, translated from French, means, to play this pattern 840 times in a row, it will be good to prepare yourself beforehand and in the greatest silence by seriously holding still. My source for that is Google Translate because my French is straight up deplorable. So what people have interpreted from these strange instructions is that Satie wrote a short theme that he intended to have played 840 times in a row, which several people and one robot have now done. There's very little instructions given on the speed Satie intended other than très lent or very slow. And the first time this was on the record as being performed, it was a marathon concert featuring several pianists taking shifts on the piece. Well, who produced this concert? None other than John Cage, the composer who currently holds the record for the longest piece ever written. That piece, you might be wondering, what's the record for the longest performance of this piece? Well, we only have an estimation because it hasn't been completed yet. It's still being performed. It's being performed as of this recording, and it will be performed long after this recording is dropped. Long after. Long enough that it's impossible to know if podcasts will even be a thing by the time this piece is finished. Now, it would be irresponsible to have a podcast called Keep Classical Weird without bringing up John Cage at least a few times, like it's almost an ethical thing. Episode 28 of this podcast was all about him, entitled Mushrooms, Prepared Piano, and 4 minutes, 33 seconds. He'll probably be brought up again in the future. He's one of those minds in our world that whether you think he's a kook or not, he gave himself benchmarks in his career in the form of thought experiments. The type that tend to stick around in a collective consciousness long after he's gone. And this piece, titled Organ 2 ASLSP, standing for As Slow as Possible, fits right into that characterization. The score for this piece is just 6 pages long and is a rather artistic-looking rendering of notes and lines that are indicating how long this should be held in relation to other notes. There is, of course, no time signature. What are you going to do? Count it for years? And it's really hard to picture what this piece would sound like in your head, even if you're someone with a good sense of pitch, because it's so slow. Go ahead, friends. How slow is it? Thank you. Well, if you look up on YouTube, you'll come up with a couple recordings that run about 7 or 8 hours long. Chump change. Let's take a quick trip to Halberstadt, Germany, shall we? In this town of less than 50,000 people, you can find the St. Buchardi Church. And inside that church is an organ that is specifically constructed by the John Cage Organ Foundation. I mean, who else would do it? That organ is set up in the St. Buchardi Church in order to play this piece this slowly. No one is sitting at the organ. The pedals are held down by sandbags. And when it comes time to change a note, people will be brought in to either add or subtract pipes on the instrument. The piece began on September 5th, 2001 to celebrate John Cage's 89th birthday. But of course, there's a little rest at the beginning, so the piece ended up beginning with a 17-month pause. Funnily enough, the foundation recalculated their efforts and realized later that the pause should have actually lasted for 28 months, but they're managing anyway. The tones started coming out of the first pipes on February 5th, 2003. The next note change, as of the time of this recording, is scheduled to happen on August 5th, 2026. When the piece is completed, it will have been playing for 639 years. It will easily take the record for the longest non-computerized piece of music ever performed. So there you go, there's the winner. The longest piece of music ever, with one caveat. British composer Jem Finer also paradoxically has the record for the longest piece of music being performed. It began on January 1st, 2000, and is scheduled to be completed on December 31st, 2999, giving us a full millennium of music. However, this music was composed not on sheet music, but by a computer algorithm. Finer took an existing piece and programmed it into a computer so that the piece would output enough variations to last the full 1,000 years. Thus, Organ 2 ASLSP needs the qualification of the longest non-computerized piece of music to be performed. If you're hearing my voice a couple centuries in the future and there are other long non-computerized pieces of music that have begun, some that may indeed be longer than Cage's piece, feel free to use this audio to make another informative podcast about them. It's an odd thing, thinking that there may be a future musician who picks up on the story long after I'm gone. In fact, in talking to people about this piece, one of the more common questions that I'm asked is, do you think the performance of Organ 2 ASLSP will be completed? The answer is, of course, that I don't know, but I have enough faith in the innate artistry of humanity to believe that we can indeed work together to perform a piece that spans several generations of us. And that's our show for today. Our theme music is composed by Thomas Barber, Check him out on Instagram at B-flat-trumpet. That's trumpet with an O. Web development support is provided by Tina at citybeautifuldesign.com. Keep Classical Weird is created and edited by me, Casey Bozell. Find us on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and keep an eye out for our future Patreon page, in which we'll start to release content to support a trip for the podcast to see that next note change in Halberstadt. Thanks so much for listening and watching, everyone. Stay safe and stay weird.